to the Bard Graduate Center. Really excited to give a talk about it's kind of a wet brown bag. This is a project that I'm working on for my dissertation currently, but it is also an extension of a lot of the scholarly work I've done throughout my academic career. So this talk is called Walking with Whitman, but it does kind of stretch back into my history. And so I'll be giving an overview of the project's history and then getting up to speed and then showing you the project as it is now. And then talk about some of the new challenges and ideas that I'm kind of working through at this moment as the project nears completion. So my name is Jesse Merandy. I'm the director of the Digital Media Lab here at the Bard Graduate Center, for those of you who don't know me. If you have any questions, those of you who are watching from live stream, hashtag Bard Grad Center TV, and at the end we'll have some time for you to ask questions that I would be happy to answer if I can, unless they're highly technical. Here we go. Oh, he's gone? No. We have a plan over here. So without further ado, let me just get right into it. So, what is it then between us? What is this count of the scores or hundreds of years between us? Whatever it is, it avails not. Distance avails not, and place avails not. So, for me, I started much different me in my master's studies at Rutgers and Camden, which is very close to one of the only remaining Whitman houses. This is the house where Whitman died in 1892. It's very well preserved. It's a New Jersey state park, and I don't know if any of you have ever been to Camden, but it's a very interesting neighborhood. And what you're seeing here, although this building looks like it's surrounded by a similar or maybe a little later time period, it's actually vast swaths of burnt out buildings, empty lots. Across the street from this, there's a prison, and it's a kind of this little time capsule nestled in this once industrial city. So my first exposure to this Whitman House was like walking through this door into like another time and place. So from a very early time, my exposure to Whitman had a lot to do with place and understanding the relationship between learning about the poet in connection to physical place, physical objects, not only the text, his books, but also they have a few artifacts from Walt Whitman's life, a cane and some like rubber galoshes he had. So there's these really interesting objects that kind of got me really interested in investigating Whitman further. So I also worked at the time on a Walt Whitman scholarly journal called the Mickle Street Review. And that was American Studies, Whitman Studies journal, which I was the managing editor for a while. But I also redesigned that site as part of my tech and scholar kind of dual personalities that I walk. And that further got me involved in the community and in touch with a lot of Whitman people, which I've continued relationships with. So one of the projects that came out of that was when I started my work in my doctoral program at CUNY Graduate Center. One of the classes I took, the objective was to create a critical edition or critical text. So I decided to make mine an online critical text, and I put the link up here, but I'm not going to show it in length just so I can pass. But I took one of Whitman's famous poems, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. When I came to New York, I found that miraculously there's this really, of course, important connection to Walt Whitman in Brooklyn. In 1855, he published the first edition of his famous book of poems, Leaves of Grass, in Brooklyn Heights. So I found this poem. I had never really gone out to Brooklyn Heights or investigated Whitman's connection, but this project became my first kind of step into Whitman in New York City. And I took the poem and I basically used I made a couple of different approaches to the poem. There was a close reading. The poem's text was laid out, and you could click on links and learn more about glossings of words, scholars' comments on certain passages. I collected all, so put them together in a hypertext edition. So at this time, just to give a little context, this is pre-mobile. My skills were in web design and creating websites. So this is still early in 2007. So where we're still pretty much tethered to desktop computers or laptops, but without the wireless technology, still kind of grounded and connected to the wall, as it were. So what was great about hypertext, though, was it allowed me to create this, what Jerome McCann called a radiant textuality, which was this idea that a hypertext system has no distinct center, yet the circumference is everywhere. So no matter how many different items I connected to this project, the scope of the investigation continued to increase, but the user could follow the path however they wanted. So I really love this idea of a user-driven way to approach a poem. Part of this came out of my kind of disdain for scansion and close reading of poetry in a way that made me feel like the poem lost some of its life as we were just reading every syllable, every meter, and breaking it down into each of the beats and measures. So it became a very kind of rote process. So I wanted to expand that, and I wanted to bring life back into it, and I also wanted to allow there to be like multimedia, which hypertext allows you to include different voices as well as multimedia voices as well. So this became a project that I invested a lot of time in, and at the end, I started to feel like that radiant structure was also flattening a little bit, because as like one of the key features of a hypertext is this democratization where every voice, every element is equally important in the structure. So I felt at a certain point, like the further I dug in, the farther I got away from the truth of the poem, but also the farther I got away from what I really cared about, which was a better understanding of who Walt Whitman was, where he came from, what his poetry meant. And I think one of the most important things for me in my literary studies academic career has been making poetry personal and figuring out how to do that, and how we can, as educators, share poetry in a way that is meaningful. And so how do we create value in poetry that student learners and adult learners can take away and bring to their own lives? So it kind of got to this point where I did as much as I could. I created a close reading section. Whitman was a notorious self-editor, so his poetry he would revisit. He printed several editions of the same book of poetry, except he would add poems, subtract poems, change semicolons to commas throughout the whole book, and he would go back and forth on these. So in his life, he revised the same text over and over again, expanded it, contracted it. By the end, the Leaves of Grass had gone from 12 poems to a huge volume of poetry. So the edition evolution tracks the one poem through each of the stages of editions. The edition comparison let you look at each of the different versions next to each other, so you could see where the changes had occurred. So Whitman, in the end, I did get to this point where I was like, this is not, the project was finished, but I really felt like there was somewhere else to go with this. And part of my stopping point has always been how far I moved forward with this project was the technology available to me. So at this time it was all web-based presentation, but coinciding with the next part of the project, which is the Walt Whitman walking tour, the first version I created of it. Walt Whitman was a walker. He walked the city. He was always traveling. He was constantly ferrying back and forth between Brooklyn and New York City. He would travel to you will learn more about, to the Crystal Palace, but he also visited the opera very often. He would love traveling in the buses and on the ferries, just talking to everybody and absorbing the city life. So I wanted to honor that kind of that essence of Whitman. He also wrote at length about the experiences of the body, the senses, his cataloging, which is one of the famous poetic techniques he uses, is much like a movie where your eye travels from one item to the next just as you look around. And so he would catalog, and in much the way hypertext is very democratic and how it gives equal weight to all voices. His poetry, Whitman's poetry, was very similar to that. So I decided to re-examine a new way to approach the Crossing Brooklyn Ferry poem. And so this passage is just, I too lived, Brooklyn of ample hills was mine. I too walked the streets of Manhattan Island and bathed in the waters around it. So I added a separate section later to the Crossing Brooklyn Ferry online critical edition, which basically took users to Brooklyn Heights. Now at this time, another context, the first iPhone was, let me get the exact date because it's worth knowing. The first iPod was released in 2001, so this is shortly after. In kind of conjunction with that were the increase of use of podcasts, and there was a lot of experimenting around connecting audio to place. So one of the parts of the influences of this project were traditional walking tours, but also this emergence of museum tours that use podcasting as a way to kind of hack the museum experience, where you would go through and listen to non-professional and alternate voices reading the artworks in the galleries. There was a famous project by David Gilbert at Marymount Manhattan College who created what he called the art mob. And they basically were trying to remix MoMA, and the students went through and created new analysis of the paintings at the MoMA. It was a really cool project, but I like this idea of being able to connect people to place intimately. So iPods were great for storage of multimedia and not much else, but it was a huge advancement in something we hadn't had before, and I didn't have at my disposal. So what I did was create basically a traditional map with locations on it, which I knew were connected to Walt Whitman, and you would go through to those locations and then play downloadable audio readings of the poetry that I recorded as Walt Whitman. So you would basically get a real, immersive experience where you're hearing Whitman's words in place. So situating the learning in places relevant to Walt Whitman's context and history, I thought would be a more powerful way to connect a user to, or a learner or user of the tour to Walt Whitman and his history. I included a lot of a packet, as you see, this travel packet, which was also had history and some of the details of the places you would visit. So this was a way I thought that would be a more personal, user-directed learning experience. And I really liked the idea of active learning and going out into the field and connecting with the place. That to me was the kind of missing link I was trying to bridge between what the hypertext allowed you to do, which always stopped at the edge of the screen. No matter how far you went into the poem, it was always restrained to the screen you were looking at. You couldn't do something like go out into the actual physical location and experience it. Now, I knew there was complications to this kind of experience because a lot, as I will get into in the next part of this, a lot has changed, of course, in Brooklyn Heights since Walt Whitman lived there. So there was a kind of balance between allowing the user to experience it as they're experiencing it, and also reflecting and looking and connecting to the history of those locations in a meaningful way, but one that might challenge our just passive kind of understanding of location, where we just pass through locations as not kind of in a way, dismissing the journey, not as much paying attention to the points in between. We would just start at our starting point and go to our destination, but lose this whole experience of the journey. So the journey is kind of like a fundamental trope of Whitman, his journeying and thinking about this movement and constant travel during his life. So I'm going to just move forward. After I finished the walking tour, I realized that there was still some shortcomings of it. Frankly, as I was developing the project, I was finding the mobile technologies had advanced so rapidly that we were finally, at that point, just starting to see geolocation, GPS, on our phones. The kind of storage and speed of computing on our mobile devices advanced so rapidly that this whole new realm of possibilities opened up. And I started to see that one of the things I was really dealing with was not just, Whitman has always been kind of the foil to a greater understanding of my own life and the time and context we're living in. I realized that mobile devices were actually changing our relationship to place. Going and being able to listen to audio tracks was just the kind of tip of the iceberg of what was possible with mobile devices as the new versions of the devices came out that were much more powerful and had functionality that was far beyond the first version that I had built. Part of that became this understanding that with mobile devices we were no longer just approaching place in a one direction way. There was a multi-directional relationship that was being created between place and person, made visible through the mobile devices. So as much as we were learning about places as we were there, places were now influencing us. People were attaching data to places. That could be as simple as a restaurant review, history of a place. So this idea of a hybrid reality started to come into being, where there's a layer of data attached to all places. That layer of data is attached to us as well. Every time we post, we interact in social networks, we're being tied to this layer of data. So there's a lot of powerful things you can do as far as learning with that layer of data. Adriana de Souza y Silva came up with this term hybrid place and hybrid space. And basically, hybrid space, she says, abrogates the distinction between physical and the digital through the mix of practices that occur simultaneously in digital and in physical spaces. So these two layers weren't necessarily separate, they were actually moving back and forth. It was a very dynamic relationship that was being created to place. So I started to think how that profoundly changed our understanding of place, how that allowed us to not only dig deeper into place, but have that history influence our own lives. So another idea was this idea of responsive places. So GPS allows us to trigger events and actions that are based on where our location is. A lot of different technologies have played with this idea, basic from like Foursquare and from other different apps that let you augment reality and layer stuff over a place. But this idea that spaces can respond to our proximity to them is also very profound. So what was lacking in the original walking tour was that the places where there was just this one direction where we were just learning about the place. But I realized that I can make this a much more personal experience based on our context, our personal context in relationship to where we were in this learning environment, which I'll show you more. This will become a little clearer, so let me move forward. So this program, one of the problems was that I didn't have the technology to realize my what I wanted to do. GPS has typically been a commercial product used for commercial means, so our use of it in open source ways that are useful in education is extremely limited, until I discovered this application which was created in the University of Wisconsin in Madison. It's called Eris, and it was a mobile app that let you build, and my first impression was I was going to build a walking tour on it. It let you use the GPS functionality of the phone to create a responsive, let me see, I think I lost my clicker here. It's all going away. I don't know if I can get back out. Oh, there we go. All right, I'm back in. So, Eris let you build these mobile games. So what I did was I took all those locations which I had basically built out as just tour stops, and I started to reimagine this game as this tour as a mobile game. So I wanted to make it a more playful experience, one that was more linked to what Whitman kind of spoke to for me, of a playful understanding of our kind of relationship to place and how we can look at it anew through our experiences in those places. So this is the back end of the program. As you'll see here, on the right is are scenes built into the game. So the user would progress through a mobile narrative that allowed you to follow a storyline, which was part of the next generation of what I did, was actually wrote a script for this game, which was something that was kind of out of my, I'd never done something like that before, but I built a mobile narrative that allowed the users to play with the idea of Whitman in a less kind of educational, but using all of the facts and history I learned and putting that into this game. So basically you would build out conversations. So this is a conversations tree. You would build out these conversations, which I'll show you in the front end shortly how this plays out. But it allowed me to create branching options for the user so that there was some choice for the user. There was also the option to connect to what I really wanted to do, was have the user write back. So it allowed for spaces for users to not only just learn, but also to write back to the game, record text as well as audio and video. And it allowed you to place those locations and events on this map with these circles of radius. So as you see, all these markers are specific moments in the tour, which are follow through in the narrative, and you can see the circles around them. When the user approaches those locations, it basically triggers events. So it definitely, I found that I could do this. The one part that was missing for me of creating this responsive experience, this game allowed me to do that. And I had to narrow down the walking tour, which previously took you over the Brooklyn Bridge and was about a 2.5-hour tour, which was substantial, but I decided to cut out the part of going across the Brooklyn Bridge. And there's definitely a give and take in this kind of a project where you have to understand the restraints of the user and their experience in a place-based learning scenario. So I found that there was a lot of decisions to make that I definitely was not anticipating until I started working in the game. So part of technology is always an understanding of the tool and working within the constraints and the different benefits of that tool. Originally, when I wanted to make it a walking tour, the more I tried to just force a walking tour into this game, the more I found it was entering the technology at the lowest level. Since it was built as a mobile gaming platform, it started to just evolve where I was one, after just playing with it and learning more about it, I was finding that there was a lot more potential for different kinds of paths that the user could take, different kinds of experiences that I could work through. So I started building out a website that would house a lot of information. One of the things I was really finding was that mobile devices are not really good for reading large blocks of text. So I kind of offshored a lot of the critical, scholarly, just facts and data. I didn't want to disassociate them. These all are accessible through the app, but I wanted there to be a place where you could go to after and also learn more about it. So in the end, I've been now, at this point, doing a lot of the detail work. Another part of the really difficult nature of this project is that I'm not only the designer, I'm the developer, I'm doing all the artwork, I'm writing the script, I'm working on the technology. Thank God somebody built the app, because I don't think I would ever finish my dissertation if that were the case. But putting into play mobile devices and looking at our relationship to our environment has been really profound in my understanding not only of Whitman, but really of how we are now interacting with place. So one of the things that location-based mobile games do is allow you to use the city as a play space, as the board game, so to speak, and it allows us also to take the idea of a game. One of the traditional ideas of game is this magic circle, and the magic circle is basically the playing field where the field takes place. But what mobile games let you do is expand that sphere into kind of infinite possibilities. So the idea of gaming in New York City or gaming in any urban environment allows us to play with spaces that are traditionally built as more functional spaces. They're sidewalks we use to travel from one place to the next. But the mobile game lets you reimagine those spaces as a playground, as a place where we are able to look closely, have new insights and understandings, and let us reimagine that space and look closely at things that we take for granted, like the history embedded in a place. There is an idea also that comes out of these mobile narratives, which is called narrative archaeology, which is a term by a man named Jeremy Height. And the idea is that one discovers the artifacts of place not by digging vertically in the ground as in traditional archaeology, but rather navigating horizontally through the ground level context of a particular space. So he built a project that was based in Los Angeles, where users would listen to voices from the past in a place, an old warehouse ground. And his idea was to create a connection to the history embedded in a place. So this is very much in line with my original project, which is I don't want to make everything upfront visible, but reinforce the idea of discovery and self-learning, because I thought only through that self-discovery and self-learning would a user walk away with something valuable for their own lives. How they could take Whitman and understand Whitman, who was writing in New York City in 1850s, and apply that to our modern life. And even though Whitman was very progressive in his poetry and what he wrote, there's still this disembodied voice that is, if just taken textually or looking at just static images, we don't get an essence of the man, and we certainly don't get an essence of the place of Brooklyn Heights or where that poetry came from. So I really like these ideas that mobile technologies were allowing us to discover these infinite layers of history that are embedded in a place. And through that, we not only realize our connection to the human history in a place, but we also realize that we have a place in that history, and that our moment is distinctly different yet linked to all those other layers of history. So this is Whitman and around the time he was writing. And so another thing I thought was really interesting is our idea of Whitman was always this old gray-beard, musty poet who was this kind of sage of wisdom. But at the time he was writing, New York City was in turmoil. It was just before the Civil War. The changes that were occurring in our country were pretty dramatic. On the technological sense, the telegraph, the railroad, and major other technological innovations were changing our understanding of place and our connection to one another. The Civil War was threatening to tear apart the very fragile and new union of states, which one thing Whitman was very attached to was this idea of the solidity of our union of the states. So this was a precarious time, and I think it's also in our current time, it's interesting to think back on how Whitman's time and the technological changes and the social and political upheaval at the time are not so dissimilar from the kind of New York we live in and the country we live in. There's these threads of tension and change that are constantly occurring. So I'm going to quickly show you the game now before I go into some of the lessons learned. Bear with me. I just wanted to show you how the game plays out, so how that kind of sense of discovery and how I think this... do I have to press the lift? Okay. Sorry. So this is the game. You find when the game's available. It's not quite there yet, which is part of why this is with. The game is called Vanishing Leaves, and the idea I came up with was that there was an unknown organization who you don't know about who's trying to eradicate Walt Whitman and the memory of his person and work from history. You are a sleeper agent who is a part of a organization which is meant to save and defend the voices, which would be, that's okay, the voices both through literature and history who are attempting to be, but my idea came out of this thinking about Amazon.com and how we can privilege certain voices and make them visible and make other voices disappear. And I think the more everything goes online, the less we have text to work with, the more we find ourselves being fed the information that we are supposed to get, as opposed to actively finding and searching out information. So I wanted to challenge that as kind of an underpinning idea in this text. So So once you load up the game, it shows you your location, and right now we are on the Upper West Side, which is far from where we needed to go, but I will just drop us in here. So when you start the game and you come out of the subway or however you get to Brooklyn Heights, you get this urgent message, and by clicking on the locations, you'll see this is very secretive. You have a guidance computer which helps you through the game in a team of both a hacking expert, technological expert, and a history, poetry expert, which are your team members who help you, both give you information to progress through the game, but also they are kind of round out this idea, like as far as my love of games, these kind of characters that help you along is one of the kind of central elements of gaming. So you basically, after you receive this information, you're briefed on your mission, and so it takes you to different locations. I'm going to click through a little bit because there's a lot of text. But once you, oops, not letting me be briefed. So you connect to the central computer, and it gives you the background of the story. It allows you to communicate with your team. It's a little slow, so sorry about that. And then along the way, you get those mission files. So as I was saying, I was embedding the history in a way that was not as obtrusive. These mission files become part of your gaming interface. So as you go along, I'm sorry, I'm not going to have the audio. I'm going to just click out of this. So you click through several screens before you meet your team, and they give you information. So there's me. So another thing you do is take a picture, and you become a character in the game. So it's another way to immerse the user in the experience. And so you dialogue with your team, and eventually you are given, this is how Whitman becomes part of this game. Your technological expert has built a artificial intelligent Walt Whitman recreation using all of his writing and all of the information that has been collected that remains of Walt Whitman to build an artificial intelligence. And the artificial intelligent Whitman is supposedly there to help you recover this missing manuscript, which is the only way to defeat the nefarious forces that are working against you, is to recover that manuscript and restore all the Whitman's writings to the public once again. So the Whitman AI was supposed to be a very playful. I'm going to click through a little bit more here. So throughout the game, now you've finally started your mission. So throughout the game, the only way to inspire Whitman to remember is to write back to the game. So throughout the game, there's what I call geo-uploads, and the geo-uploads are just moments when you're asked to perform a task. And it might be to take a picture of something around you, or it might be to write a small poem, something very small that allows you to, basically the only way to move through the game is to complete those actions. And every time you complete an action, the Whitman AI becomes smarter and remembers more. And so you're actually building and speaking into the Walt Whitman AI to build its power and to help it remember the missing location of the manuscript. And this is all just a playful way to get you to move through Brooklyn Heights, visit these locations. So the first location that you're charged with going to is the Rome Brothers print shop, which is where Walt Whitman published the first edition of Leaves of Grass. So the mission locations are meant to be locations that are tied very specifically to Whitman, and they also help the Whitman AI recall. And there's more to how the Whitman AI is kind of fragmented a little bit at the beginning, and he repeats himself and speaks in broken language a little bit at the beginning. But as he progresses, he becomes more fluent and has a larger vocabulary and speaks to you in a way that gives you an idea of Whitman's poetry. As you help him recall, he launches into spontaneous poetry and will recite a phrase or a small bit of a poem from that location. So Song of Myself was one of the most important poems of Leaves of Grass. So he'll give you a little bit of that. So you're learning about the location, you're hearing his words, very similar to what the walking tour is doing, but now it's become a more immersive, interactive experience and a little more playful, and I think a little more fun for the users to go out and kind of be directing the action and being more responsible for how the game progresses. So I'm going to switch back to the other lecture. So that game will be available shortly. Essentially, at this point, I'm doing a very deep dive into some of the more details of the game to just flesh out the historical relevant context of each location. Part of the difficulty of this game was that it led me in these unexpected places, and I felt like sometimes I got to this point where I felt like I didn't know anything about Whitman or the locations, because it was just the deeper I dug and the more I was researching, the farther back the history of these locations went, and the more I had these kind of revelations. So I think this project for me has been very interesting in that it's been as much about trying to help other people learn as much as it's been about my own self-learning. And part of like creating these digital projects and working through building out the rich background and context of this project has been that I've learned and come into contact with so much more detail, so many people, a whole community of Whitman scholars, a whole community of people who live in Brooklyn Heights, and also tapping kind of into this rich history. So this next part of the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the outcomes and challenges that I'm experiencing that I think are really relevant to how we use mobile devices, how they help us to see our present situation, and I hope I can bring these out in the game, and the game does a lot of this, but part of my writing, part of this being a digital humanities project, which is my dissertation, is that it's not just enough to build a project. I have to think deeply about the foundation, theoretical foundation, as well as the scholarly research that goes into really knowing Whitman, knowing his history. So there's all these facets that are kind of swirling around that I'm trying to corral at the same time, and I hope that the walking tour does this well. In the end, I'm going to present the project to the world, and that's going to be its testing ground. I think typically you would do testing, human testing, but I think for me, I'm presenting this more as an option and a way to use mobile technologies to look at ways we can teach place-based learning, immersive learning, looking at mobile narratives, looking at how mobile devices influence how we compose, how we move. There's a lot of different things that I'm already dealing with, so the testing I'm going to leave as more of a thing to do in the future, and it will keep me from filling out an IRB and coming out with a whole plan of action for human research, but I invite you all to test it in the end. So one of the first revelations I had was that when dealing with projects that work with place, you have to be open to frustration and challenges. So the first location, and the reason I wanted to go out to Brooklyn Heights, was the Rome Brothers print shop, as I showed it on the game, which is your first destination. It's also right outside, as you see here, of the High Street AC line. So you kind of, I had anticipated I was going to go to the Rome Brothers print shop and see it and take pictures of it as a way to embed those images and kind of understand the place that I was going to be working with. And so from my research, I knew that the Rome Brothers print shop was a 3-story brick building right on the southwest corner of Cranberry Street in Fulton. But when I got out of the subway, there was just this circle, and there's the only building, the only connection to Whitman really around was what was called the Whitman Close, which are apartment complexes basically named after Whitman. So I kept looking around. I was like, I must be in the wrong place. But I realized through my research that this building didn't exist anymore. This is a map of Brooklyn and Whitman's time. This location right here is the intersection of Cranberry Street and Fulton Street. The problem is that this whole area in the early 50s was claimed by the Slum Clearance Committee, which was led by Robert Moses, as a blighted area. So this was kind of a shock to me, and it launched me into a whole history of this place, which was really exciting and unexpected and really complicated the idea of place and history of a place in a way that I wasn't expecting. One of the interesting things was that in the early 60s, when they were set to redevelop this place in what would become Cadman Plaza, which was a high-rise luxury / affordable housing tower, as well as these several low-lying buildings, complexes. In addition to the Cadman Plaza, so this whole area here and this area here was basically razed. Over 86 buildings were knocked to the ground in order to build the park and build the Cadman Plaza complex. There was a fight launched by local residents and people who knew and lived there that this was an important place historically, both for our American literature, but also there was a character to these brick buildings that was very uniquely Brooklyn Heights that they were threatening to replace with a high-rise tower. The mayors, however, despite an effort by local citizens and poets, including Carl Sandburg, Robert Frost, Marianne Moore, Arthur Miller, in an attempt to try to turn the location into a historic landmark, the Mayor's Preservation Committee reported, and as the New York Times says, quite correctly, that the Whitman building is of no particular architectural distinction and retains no vestiges of its literary role. So, they knocked that building down, which is in 1964, and I'll just add this here. So one of the other interesting things was I learned in 1931 they installed a plaque on the building to mark the spot. So it was marked as this historic place, and people would gather there every year to celebrate Walt Whitman on his birthday. And this kind of history was on this plaque was on the side of the building above the garbage. So if you went to the side of the building, you could only see it but this is the presentation of that plaque, and this is the man who sculpted it. His name is Alexander Finna, and he's a very interesting man. I could talk about him a little bit more, but these were other things I learned about the location. So here is the building right before. As you'll see, all the buildings around it are being knocked down, and what's left standing is that brick building, kind of a very lonely tooth in the mouth of Brooklyn Heights here. You gotta love the car here with the really great lines there. So I started to look for the issue was that I couldn't find any pictures. So I showed you pictures of the print house, but I couldn't find any images when I was doing my research. I was forced to go to the Brooklyn Historic Society and the New York Public Library to their offline resources to find images. It was like this place had just been wiped away from history, the only connection being this sign that said Whitman Close. So it was, to me, really surprising that this rather important historic landmark had just been wiped away from history. So I found one blog post by a woman, her name was Lorna Saltzman, and she was writing as a person who lived there about how they got Cadman Plaza wrong. And she told a story about this restaurant was run by a Nicaraguan man who, one of the famous poets, Nicaraguan poets, I believe his first name, Junot Diaz, was a huge Whitman fan and was inspired by Whitman. And he told this woman when she went in, you Americans don't appreciate your own history. And he took the plaque down and gave it to the Nicaraguan consulate. And before they knocked the building down, that plaque is also lost in history. I found other articles that said the plaque was given to the Walt Whitman birthplace, which is in West Hills in Long Island, but the record of it is lost. The consulate doesn't know where it is. The Walt Whitman House in Long Island doesn't know where it is, so it's not in their storage. So this is an interesting moment where I really felt like there's this privileging of voice in history too. This woman who just wrote a blog, no matter how many Times articles I would read, didn't detail any of this and didn't really even detail the demolition of the building. Another man I spoke to, his name was Philip Wellens. His father was part of that preservation committee who attempted to save the building. He said he had told me that his father had been involved, and his brother as well, in trying to save the building, but in the end their voices too were eradicated. And he told me that the New York Times, who I was getting a lot of the fine details of dates and whatnot, were the owners of the New York Times had relationships with the developers, and so they would not put forward any information about the Whitman House's importance. They kind of buried that. So it was interesting. I learned a lot in this moment about privileging of voices from our past, and so part of that narrative archaeology that I was undertaking here is hopefully to bring that history back to light. Another interesting thing I was coming into contact with was that there was this idea of new revelations. And although I came to the Rome Brothers print shop, I found out there was this Whitman Park. I was really excited. And so the Whitman Park would be right here, also part of this redevelopment. This was parkland that was bought by the city and then given to New York State Parks. It was built in 1955, the actual park, and I'll show you what that looks like. I went to visit the park, and I got there at night. It was so bad, you have to plan ahead when you do these things, but I spent too much time at the other location, and by now this was like, there's a Walt Whitman Park here. So I went back, but the Walt Whitman Park interestingly had this sign here, which detailed Walt Whitman's importance. A little late because they knocked down the one true connection to Walt Whitman. But you'll also see that this is not a beautiful park. And it was also agreed that they would refurbish the park, but only after they had built the federal court building here. So that part of the deal was that they would make it half the park a parking lot. So this is the parking lot. But this multi-million-dollar renovation, it was about $4.5 million, finally reopened in 2013, and they built a very beautiful fountain right here. You'll see there's Walt Whitman's poems are surrounding. There's 4 different poems placed around the fountain, and there's a button you can hit and the water comes up. And so when I was there, this guy kept hitting the button, playing around with the water, and there was also kids playing in it. And another time I visited, there was dogs running through the fountain. So it's like it had become a place of play and reimagined. So in a way, there's this connection to Whitman, which emerged out of a place that had no connection to him, in a way, although Brooklyn Heights is connected to him. I thought it was really interesting that there were new threads of history being created in the present moment. And in a way, they're loosely tied to this area and to the person, yet putting his words in the ground and locating him here was still, although, as I was saying, kind of a little too late, but it is a nice gesture, and it is a much nicer park than the one that was attributed to him before. So this, let's see here if I can. So I also found myself relearning a little of the history. I guess I have to switch from this device. Another location that was connected to Whitman was the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, where he was an editor of the paper for 2 years before he was let go for his support of this free soil movement, which was basically tied to in our history of slavery in the United States, new territories that were added had to be decided about which ones would allow slavery or not. So part of this was this Wilmot Proviso, which stated that all new lands would not be allowed to have slaves. And Whitman took a stance on that, and it was said that he was let go. So I was like, great, another location which is tied to Whitman. So I went to the building, and this was basically, I knew that the building large parts of this building I showed you here before, the Eagle building, had been razed, but a small part of it had been preserved. So the new architect had built this, the Eagle warehouse around that existing structure. So forever, I thought it was this here in the middle, which had a kind of distinct, different look to the rest of the building, and it made sense that it was built around. And there's a plaque outside the front of the building too, so it further convinced me. Yet the more research I did, I realized that I had actually been looking in the wrong place. You had to go around the side of the building, and you can see here that actually this structure here is what had been built around, and this was the original press room. Further research also showed me that this was built in 1882, and although Whitman lived to 1892, he would not have worked in this location. This was the location of the original Eagle building. However, that structure also doesn't exist, but this is a thread, and it's funny that history is being built around it. So another kind of interesting part about this building, the walking tour, is that I've had more time to look closely and revisit and spend time in this location, which had, frankly, I have been overlooking and misreading the signs that had been provided to me. So this was another interesting moment. And so one of the other things, so part of the Academy Plaza was that there's highly politicized elements about this neighborhood and its redevelopment. And currently there is a Codman Plaza happened in the 50s and 60s, but it's happening again with the waterfront redevelopment. So part of like the tour took you to the Brooklyn Promenade, where you would look out and you could see this amazing view of Manhattan. And in Whitman's time, it would have looked similar to this, where he writes about the tall masts of Manhattan that are kind of stitching the background, and you could basically see through Manhattan to New Jersey in the background. So it was interesting to look at this as a counterpoint. And so this is from the 80s. So at this point, the whole of the waterfront was a shipping yard, and the Port Authority owned the buildings and were looking for ways in the 50s, again, to redevelop it. Part of what is under the Brooklyn Promenade, for those of you who don't know, it's the BQE, and the BQE and the Promenade are also another Robert Moses project, where he built this cantilevered structure that basically pleased the Brooklyn Heights residents, who were wealthy, who had this beautiful view and private gardens, which they basically knocked down, which was the better alternative than running the BQE right through Brooklyn Heights, which is what they threatened. So this was kind of the concession, was this promenade. And when I started the project, this view was much different, and I'll zoom in a little closer, but you can see that all of the warehouses and shipping piers have been raised. And what replaced it, this was part of the redevelopment plan. It was a very unique plan in which the waterfront redevelopment was paid for by this residential structure, which is right here, which is called the Pier House. This was part luxury housing, part affordable housing, and a hotel. And part of the Brooklyn Historic Conservation was that there was a sightline law put into place where you couldn't build over a certain height, except on the very ends of the location, which are unfortunately where this building was built. And there was a mandate that it couldn't be above a certain height, and you'll see that it creates quite a challenge. They built this bridge, which you saw here. They called the Squid Bridge, which was this very rocky bridge. It kind of wobbled when you walked over it. It was a very interesting, kind of new thing. When I started the walking tour, this bridge didn't exist. You had to walk all the way around to get to the Brooklyn Park and to the Fulton Ferry Pier, which is another location which Whitman would have traveled from the pier from Brooklyn to Manhattan. And this says, what is that a bounce in your step? In only a year, they fenced off the bridge. You see people walking there. And have now they're undergoing a multi-million-dollar renovation of the bridge that just opened because of that wobble, which was supposed to be a unique kind of facet of this suspension bridge. Like, people were like scared to walk across the bridge. So it was kind of funny. Now, when I went back recently to just check on some locations and work through, I didn't know that they had closed the bridge. So I came to it and was like, oh, the bridge is closed, and there's this lock on it. It was also the first time, as you can see, the bridge is like the building in the back is looming in the structure, and there's this fence around it. The whole of the location, I'm constantly having to tinker with it, how you move through the locations that I've outlined, because now what once was an easy trip across this bridge is not available, and it starts me to thinking about like the long-term stability of a project like this, and whether or not it's one moment that I'm dealing with, or if this has sustainability at all. How much will change in the next 5-10 years? So only in 5 years there's a whole new park and all these new buildings, and it's the face of this landscape has been completely redefined. And shortly they'll be building on Pier 6, which is over here. There's another battle being waged against another high-rise building. And the park has been hugely successful, and I'll get to why there's a give and take with this. It's not just losing a sight line necessarily. Part of the redevelopment, I'm going to zoom us in here, the Fulton Ferry Pier, this is the old Fulton Ferry Pier, which housed the Fulton Ferry until 1924, when they discontinued it due to the Brooklyn Bridge being built in late 1800s. The Brooklyn Bridge basically rendered the ferry obsolete, and people stopped using it. And so shortly after it stopped being used, it also burned to the ground, and they slowly dismantled the pier. In the 70s, it became a completely run-down building. The whole location was run down, and like if there were ever a blight, it certainly, like Brooklyn Heights at that time, looked like that. This is a view from the pier just when I started this project. In 1977, the area was designated a landmark, and I believe, let's see if I can find this. Shortly after, when this was reopened, part of the redevelopment process was first to redo this pier. So as you see along here on the edge, which extends actually all the way around the pier, is parts of the text from crossing Brooklyn Ferry. So here's another instance of like a connection to Whitman and Whitman's influence on the area, although it's always slightly detached from the actual reality of the history of that place. So another part, this is from the movie Adjustment Bureau. I don't know if any of you have ever read the Philip Dick a short story called Adjustment Team, or seen the movie, but basically there's an underground organization which has taken fate out of our hands, and all of our happy little accidents are actually predetermined. One time when I led a walking tour to the Brooklyn Pier, they were filming this movie, which I thought was a great connection, and part of the culmination of the tour is to go out onto the pier and read Walt Whitman's words, and there was helicopters flying, and the whole area was blocked off, and this is what they were filming, which I thought was hilarious. As always be open to change. So this is called the Granite Prospect, and this is part of the great new give and take. So despite the loss of part of that view on the promenade is this great new park. And one of the really awesome new threads to Whitman has been that every year at this location they hold a Song of Myself marathon and read the entirety of this poem, which takes over 2 hours, breaking it into sections and different readers reading it. One of my here's another Whitman impersonator. So now I know 2 Whitman impersonators. You need one for a party. This is the more rustic version and the very combed beard one that I knew before. But I like this idea of like Whitman kind of being reattached to the place again through a community, through people. And so there's this like vital energy, although some things are lost, some things are gained, and there's this beautiful gathering now here every year. And although last year there was a huge storm, they called it the Waltz storm. The Waltz storm, it poured on the event. But so this is me, and I performed at the event in 2013 and 14, where my section of the poem I performed as a musical section. And there was somebody did a lasso dance, and like people did performance art. It's really an amazing moment to just sit out there and look at this kind of sight lines that Whitman would have loved to have seen, this kind of real, personal, and reimagined kind of connection to him. And I think what it's taught me is that there's this community of people that keep this memory alive, and so the place holds a certain memory, but without the people to connect it, and without the people to put those plaques up to keep the memory of Whitman alive, without new people coming to learn about the history of places, and without people to reinsert those voices which get buried and lost, it's easy to have something like in my game where Whitman's voice is lost. It could be a reality. We can be careless about the history we preserve and about how we preserve that history. And so I think in the end I've been open to this possibility of, as a personal project for me, this has become a lifelong pursuit where I've been connected to Whitman, and Whitman just leads me to new understandings of my own life, of history, of my place in this human history. And I wait for these moments like this image where everything is just perfect and in alignment. And for me, I can have these moments where I can understand what my time and my space is, and I can think deeply about all the things that are impacting my life and shaping who I am. And the mobile device sent me here. This idea of the project and connecting other people to it brought me to this place. So I feel fortunate to be able to revisit this place and think deeply about these issues. And I hope, this was a lot. It's hard to cover some of the technicals with all of the philosophical and the kind of the fundamental scholarly ideas I'm dealing with too. But if you have any further questions about any of that, I would be happy to we have about 15 minutes to talk about any of this or ask questions on things I glossed over too quickly. Yeah?
I have just a quick question.
Yeah.
I have a lot of questions, but do you have an intended audience for this game in terms of, there's a pedagogical teaching element and a scholarly element to it?
Yeah, I started because I was teaching composition at the college level. I was looking for ways to have the understanding of writing as a personal endeavor that comes out of our experience of place and comes out of our social context, our environmental context. So that was originally my intention, but I think the more I thought about it, the more I want to encourage learning from people who don't have access in academia or to college education. I wanted anybody interested in poetry, Whitman, or New York City history to be able to experience this too. And so part of it has been opening it up. And I've gotten, it's funny, like through the time I've been working on this, I've gotten like an email from a high school teacher who said, "Where does your project go? I use it every year to teach my high school students about New York City, and they're not even in New York City, and about Walt Whitman." And so I keep getting feedback across time that is showing me that it has uses in other ways and in other places besides the places I had originally intended it to be used. And I think that's the great thing about a mobile device, is that the classroom is expanded to everywhere. we don't have to be confined to a classroom with a teacher leading the class. You're more free to kind of lead that learning experience. And frankly, you could turn off the game and just walk around, and you still are going to get a richer experience of this location if you're cued into being mindful in those places. So the project was also then, at that point, it walks a line between literary history and understanding of writing and comp ret history and technique, which is something I'm also really interested in, because teaching of writing is a real application of learning about writers, and to me that's the most important. I find it most beneficial to send people away with skills and tools they can use in their life to shape what they do, as opposed to reading a poem and walking with a better understanding of the rhyme scheme is important, but I think coming away with actionable items in learning is more important for me. So I think that can apply to anyone. Yeah.
Jesse, this is such a terrific project to hear about, and I'm really glad to have heard your outline of it. My question is about the constraints of technology. And there are two things that struck me about this, and they're related. And I just wonder about how you would respond to this. One is, if the app platform that you're using were available not as a game, but in some other form, would you have chosen to make it a game anyway? That is, were you constrained in your development of this by the framework within which you placed it, that was provided, or that was available? That's the first. And related to this, that may not seem to be, but I think it is at one point you mentioned that your research took you to archives that were not online at the Brooklyn Historical and New York Public Library. Now, as an historian, that's where I start.
Yeah.
I don't start online because that's a constraint.
Yeah.
If one starts to think that it's only what's online that is truly available, you are falling into a terrible trap as an historian, which is that you are being constrained in what you think is available to you. So you've got to go to the inconvenient lengths that you went to. I'm going to say that in one way, that should be, and it always has been in my practice, I became a historian before the internet was invented, that should be the starting point. So I wonder what your reflections on this nature of constraint, technological constraint might be.
Well, the platform did constrain me and freed me. I felt constrained because the idea of the walking tour it had become kind of, it seemed like it was underusing the platform, but that pushed me to go further with it. And I probably I don't think I would have made a game. To answer that part of the question, I think I probably would have, I may have just left the walking tour alone and not continued to look at this area and neighborhood and what I could find there. The platform does, mobile devices as a platform and the game as an app in the platform do have constraints. It's only available on iPhone right now. It's only available to someone who then has the iPhone and the app. So those are real constraints. So at the same time I'm showing the possibilities, I have also tried to be conscientious of the fact that there is an audience that is constantly being left out. Mm-hmm. And it's a real struggle with technology and education, is that there's always somebody on the outside, no matter how far you go, to try to make this experience usable by everyone. It seems that I have to walk that line between doing something that I can share or never releasing it or revealing it because it's never perfect enough to do all the things I really want. If I had my way, everybody would be able to use it, and it would be on a technology that was accessible by everyone.
I really wanted to do it, and I'm left out because I'm Android.
I'm pushing the developers to actually to also develop the app for the other devices that are not iPhone. And so the other part about the constraints of research is that I also, in my undergrad, we didn't have online resources at all. So my research history had also been going first to books and archives. However, I think, so the web offers us a great starting point in a way that we didn't have before. But I think like some of the voices that I found that complicated my understanding of history, I wouldn't have found in the library either, because I start to feel like Brooklyn Historical, for whichever reasons in their administration and how they make available the resources, have chosen to digitize and restrain the use of those digitized elements to 2 computers at the location, which are old and slow. And in order to even get some of the high-res versions of those, you have to pay them. So there are restrictions even with going to these resources now, which are digitized and kept offline. Other places like New York Public Library have digitized and had a similar model for accessing and using, have now made all of their public domain items free for use. So that's another institution operating under different policies. And I've ended up not using the Historical Society images because I frankly don't have the funds to pay their usage fees, which are rather high for one image, and if I wanted to use multiple. So I found approximate images in NYPL. And so I think like part of that is also then those voices like the woman I spoke to, and those histories aren't in the libraries and aren't in archives. So there's always further to go. Yeah, there's always more, and the farther you dig, you find new paths. For instance, the Rome Brothers print shop. I found a New York Times article that was written in 1939 that said that building that got knocked down and everybody cared so much about was actually a building that replaced the original building. And so I don't even know at this point what the truth is to that, because it was one article in one place and everybody else was rallying to save the building. So I don't even know. And it was from the New York Times, which I complicated already as something that may not be a reliable kind of source of information in this instance, especially with their opinionated language saying that the Mayor's Preservation Committee reported quite correctly, which you wouldn't say in an objective article. So I feel like the constraints we deal with are part of the complication of understanding history and the slipperiness of history, and what voices are privileged, what remains as part of continuing that history. Yeah.
How has the advent of augmented reality and the success of games like Pokemon Go affected how you want to approach maybe future iterations of the app, or how does that line up with what you're doing?
It's a good question, because at the onset of the development of this project, and when I finished the first walking tour, that was when augmented reality emerged. So this is late 2009. So people were coming up with ways to hold up your phone and find out where the nearest like car repair was or plumber, and you could see it on your phone and like navigate yourself to that. And people started like figuring out ways to layer images over, like historical images over actual places. And I love that idea, and I was all for it. The technology actually disappeared in a way where like nobody invested in that development. And I don't know if it was just because it was for commercial use. The primary uses were commercially driven. And so what people were doing educationally and in academia was they were not pursuing augmented reality. The investments that were being made were short-term and kind of dissipated. Now, to me, it's really interesting to see Pokemon kind of emerge the idea of augmented reality, and I don't know if, until those platforms are available to people to redevelop and hack, and that means being open source and not proprietary, which I'm certain Pokemon Go is a proprietary technology. I think that that's part of the challenge, is the tools we have access to. And that kind of I really like the idea of the augmented reality because it can send you to places you wouldn't normally go, just like the mobile app can. But by using the phone as an interface and seeing through it and seeing things layered over it, it creates even a more tangible connection between like our experience and how the phone is mediating between the digital world and our physical world. And so I really like that, but I think for now I'm going to just leave it alone. And I had ideas, particularly the historic images at the same locations of the views of like Whitman's time and our time as a way to juxtapose those would be really powerful. I just don't find it will be feasible. And so I'll offer those images for you to look at on the app, but that kind of layering is not, for me right now, not something I would pursue. But
I feel like you
I love
preempted it with the
Yeah.
game and
Yeah. I wanted it to go there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sort of the same issue as far as being able to work with it, but conceptually, obviously the big push now, technology-wise, and a lot of investment is into virtual reality. And selling a lot of stuff and then moving toward it with all the phones and everything like that. How does it conceptually affect the idea of mobile being about a place, where virtual reality is sort of about a place, but it's talking about mediation of what view is given. It's a much stronger mediation because whatever is represented is what is represented. If you have no option to see anything other than what's been given to you.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for me, the creation of an immersive experience was one that retained a strong connection to our physical presence, whereas virtual reality and VR, especially a lot of the stuff that now wearing the goggles or the different programs that have come out recently that create this immersive experience, but where you are fully immersed. Part of connecting, I think, the learner to the physical environment is to remain present in the moment. So I think the benefits would be you could take somebody who's not in New York to the places in a way that you couldn't do otherwise. But I think my stress is active learning, and I want the action to be the person going and experiencing, because I think that's the root of that. Experiential learning is what creates life value for us, because we can use that experience and think about our position in the place in a way that, if it's not grounded in the place, I find it's a different experience. I don't think I want full immersion. There's many cautionary tales, but I think like thinking about connecting to Whitman particularly because he was there. Like, I want that to be the driving force, that your sensory experience of a place is not just visual, but also hearing the sounds of Brooklyn, hearing the water, hearing the ships, people around you, smelling the city, all these tactile experiences, which are much richer for me. Maybe we'll get there with VR technology, but that kind of like fullness is part of Whitman's poetry. He was writing from all the senses. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback on Evan's question about constraint. In the first iteration on the website, you had sort of a packet with information that people would sort of correspond. But then in the app, with this more like choose your own adventure experience, is there a way to ensure that people still get all the information you want, or is that a priority for you?
I think driving the website will be the driving way to house that information, and that would be accessible to anyone. The problem with trying to present an experience is that it will be hard to do a one-to-one if you're not doing the game as how I designed it and planned it. My dissertation committee is pushing to some degree to think of ways that the game could be accessible. So one of the good things about this mobile app is that you could actually go on the tour without, as you saw the blue beacon which shows where you are, you don't necessarily have to be in the place. You can click through the locations, and the storyline has triggers built into the locations. Essentially, after you read something, another location shows up. So you could progress through the game without actually being in the location, and that would still connect you to the information. But I think I'll make a strong effort to have teaching resources for people, or learning resources for people who want to just connect to the information. And there's a lot of data that's going to go into that back end, but there's also a ton of data on Whitman elsewhere too, which I'm pulling from all over and distilling, but I think I want to create an intro to it, but also allow for paths to go for people to pursue it on their own as well. Because I think the self-directed learning means that if you're interested, you go further because you want to. Yeah. Did somebody?
I have one, I mean,
Yeah.
just having people have their choose their own adventure and interact seems very connected in some ways to the performative aspect of the Whitman Song Myself performance or this gathering, and you're kind of asking people to have their own performance by doing it, and they're doing it in different ways. And can you see how people are using it? I mean, that's an interesting data set to collect how people then interact with the game and how they perform the ritual of Whitman, which you're creating.
I think part of the writing, so one of the things I had to deal with was our connection to like social media and how we actually share information and connect ourselves in the digital world, our experiences. And I made an effort to, there was these geo-uploads, which were these moments about writing back, which will be documented. I'm still thinking about ways to take those elements, if people are willing to share them, and making that be the record of people's performance, how they approach those geo-uploads, whether they take a video or record audio, or I want to make avenues for that kind of performance. There is what they were, I forget the exact term, but it's a good one. There's a threshold that you have to, I think, take into account, and I'm not able to find it right now in my head, but I can speak to it. That there's this idea that at a certain point we like are saturated, and I'm asking a lot already to go walk, read, be aware, and then also write. And so there's a lot, and you're simultaneously navigating a digital world and the physical world. So it's highly demanding in a way, cognitively, and I think that's one of the great things about it, but it's also a challenge to know how much to do, how much is too much. That was part of like restraining how many sites of interaction there were. It meant that I had to plan for people to be in certain places where they'd have a safe space to write or think, as opposed to, there's obvious dangers of walking and living in a city that are important to consider. And so that was another thing. So along the way, I think the performance and the performative nature is something that I love, and I hope that those talkback elements, those things I'm building in as ways to speak back to the game, they are recorded in the game. Everyone's would be recorded, but I am looking for ways to thread those and spit them out to either Twitter or Instagram, or some way to collect them so that people can see them and grow that layer of people planting data and information, personal experiences to location. That's important to me, because I think Whitman always wrote about the poets to come. Like, his work was there as a baseline. He was so modest for everyone that came after. And he was thinking conscientiously about the impact of his work and his position in human history. So I think that's important, is like the next generation leave their mark and their words and their history as well, and that those are documented somehow. So archiving and making visible that record will be a challenge of the project, and I think part of what I'm working through in the end game is those final questions, actually. So I didn't look online, but if anybody has any other questions, please.